The screen is black. A child's whisper breaks the silence. They told me not to speak, or I would vanish. Then, a soft, almost inaudible chant begins, one voice, then 12, rising in unison, layered with static. The camera flickers on an abandoned convent in the rural Midwest, 1883. Windows boarded, paint peeling, the air thick with dust and decay. The locals call it St. Agnes, home for the forsaken, but no one dares approach after sundown. For decades, something unspeakable happened here. Families reported children who never returned. Parishioners whispered of pregnancies, impossible births, and shadows moving in halls where no one should have walked. Historical records are scarce, intentionally erased, but what survived paints a portrait of desire, corruption, and a ritual that should have stayed buried. This story is about 12 nuns, a single enslaved man, and a secret so dark that the Vatican, when it finally learned of it decades later, attempted to obliterate every trace. Behind every painted ceiling, behind the hymns of devotion, lies a trauma that twists belief into horror. By the end of this journey, you will question the sanctity of institutions you trusted, the hidden lives of those cloistered behind holy walls, and the cost of silence when evil is enshrined as sacred. In the heart of Indiana, in 1880, the town of Willowbrook thrived on the promise of piety and progress. Its red brick streets were lined with maple trees, and smoke from chimneys hinted at industrious families. Yet beneath this idyllic facade, whispers circulated, children who vanished without cause, servants whose eyes carried knowledge they could never speak aloud. The convent had been built on a ridge overlooking the river, a stark monument of devotion, its spires slicing into the sky. It was intended as a sanctuary, but the sanctuary became a cage. Locals reported hearing faint wails on moonless nights. Sometimes, a faint rhythm of footsteps would echo in the empty halls, though the convent was officially home to only a dozen nuns. Behind the walls, discipline masked something far darker. Clerical reports praised their virtue and dedication, but secret correspondences discovered decades later hint at manipulation and control, cloaked in sacred ritual. The nuns were not merely women of God, they were enforcers of a hidden doctrine, one that exploited innocence, lust, and fear. And at the center of it all was a single man, brought into the convent under the pretense of servitude, whose body and will were claimed as property, shared among 12 women sworn to celibacy. By today's standards, the implications are monstrous. In 1883, they were whispered about as cursed. By the time the first child was born, the lines between sin and salvation had already blurred. His name, recorded in fragments, was Elijah Moore, a young African-American man sold into servitude at the age of 19. Elijah had been raised in the shadow of cotton fields, the echoes of whips and prayers etched into his memory. When he arrived at St. Agnes' home, he was promised work, shelter, and the chance to serve the divine, but the true nature of his captivity was far more sinister. He was assigned tasks that ranged from mundane cleaning to tending the convent's gardens, yet each night brought encounters he could not refuse. The nuns, one by one, claimed him, their devotions twisted into ritualized acts of possession. Scripture was cited in distorted interpretations, vows of chastity were enforced selectively, yet every act of exploitation was justified as sacred necessity. Elijah's days blended into nights, a perpetual cycle of obedience, exhaustion, and terror. His pleas went unheard, the town outside had no eyes within the convent. The priests overseeing St. Agnes were complicit through silence or willful ignorance. And as the years unfolded, 12 nuns became mothers to a secret lineage, each pregnancy hidden behind locked doors, empty confessionals, and hushed hysteria. Every room in the convent became a stage for ritual and control. Candles burned long into the night, casting shadows that seemed almost human. The air smelled of incense, decay, and fear. Elijah's existence was reduced to a series of survival instincts: obey, hide, endure. Yet even in the darkest hours, he whispered prayers, not to the nuns, but to a God who might one day witness the horrors they had inflicted. The first pregnancy came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Sister Margaret, the youngest of the 12, began to exhibit symptoms: fatigue, nausea, an unsettling flush that the other nuns pretended to ignore. She concealed it behind the routine of daily prayer, brushing it off as divine weakness or penitence. Yet the nuns understood the significance. The first child would set a precedent, a secret bound in fear and ritual. Elijah witnessed the transformation in silence. Every glance, every whispered exchange between the nuns, reinforced the suffocating hierarchy. The birth was orchestrated in secrecy, a hidden chamber beneath the convent floor, accessible only through a narrow stairwell cloaked in shadow. The child was not baptized publicly. It was a living symbol of forbidden desire, a testament to the absolute control the nuns wielded. The arrival of the child altered the convent's rhythm. Some nuns whispered of guilt, others of inevitability. The priest assigned to oversee the convent left shortly after, citing irreconcilable spiritual divergence, but the true reason was known only to those within the walls. The power structure had shifted, and the sin had taken root. This first birth marked the beginning of a chain reaction. Each subsequent pregnancy, each whispered confession, each act of exploitation became part of a cyclical nightmare. The town outside remained oblivious. Willowbrook's serenity masked the horrors within, where 12 women shared one man, and one man carried the weight of 12 corrupted devotions. The nuns devised a twisted ritual to justify their actions. In their private journals, many later destroyed, there are references to an ancient covenant, a doctrine they claimed had been passed down through unrecorded church history. It combined elements of Old Testament obedience, apocryphal visions, and superstition. By their reasoning, Elijah was both sinner and sacrament, vessel and victim. Each encounter was cloaked in ceremonial language, whispered Latin, candlelit altars, and chants meant to sanctify acts of violence and desire. To the outside world, these were women of pure devotion, but inside, devotion had mutated into obsession. The psychological manipulation was profound. The nuns convinced themselves they were enacting divine will, even as they stripped a man of autonomy and dignity. The atmosphere in the convent thickened with each passing year. Walls seemed to pulse with secrecy. Children born within these walls were hidden in attics, rooms behind false panels, or sent to distant orphanages with falsified papers. Records were scrubbed, letters intercepted, and memories suppressed through intimidation and ritualized fear. Elijah, once a man of agency, became a ghost within his own life. The nun's psychological grip extended to all who entered the convent. The cook who witnessed a birth disappeared, the gardener who questioned doctrine was reassigned indefinitely. Fear was their most potent tool, and it preserved a cycle of abuse that lasted for 5 years. Willowbrook, though small, had eyes and ears everywhere, but the convent was impervious. Its spires cast long shadows, both literal and metaphorical, and its reputation as a sacred refuge discouraged scrutiny. Parishioners who suspected something amiss were silenced through subtle threats or socially orchestrated exclusion. Gossip was enough to ruin a family. The nuns knew it and wielded it expertly. Stories of missing children circulated for decades. Some were dismissed as absconded orphans, others blamed on itinerant workers or the natural dangers of frontier life. But fragments remained: a farmer's son found wandering near the woods, a maid who spoke of chanting late at night, a neighbor who noticed wet footprints leading to the convent basement. No one dared connect the dots. The nuns cultivated this blindness, projecting purity and suffering in equal measure. Candles burned at vigils, hymns rose each morning, and the town's trust was cemented by centuries of indoctrination. Yet inside, a horror persisted that no outsider could imagine: a shared body, 12 mothers, and children born into secrecy. Even the priests were not immune to manipulation. Letters were forged, confessions altered, and absolution granted under false pretenses. The church hierarchy had a veneer of sanctity, but beneath it lay rot and fear, a system that enabled abuse and erased evidence. For Willowbrook, appearances were everything. For St. Agnes, appearances were survival. Elijah's existence became a labyrinth of fear, desire, and suppressed rage. Each day was measured in ritualized chores, each night dictated by the nuns' claims of divine necessity. Sleep offered no respite, the convent's shadows seemed to move with intent, whispering promises of salvation while suffocating any hope of escape. The nuns' faces were masks of serenity during the day, but at night their eyes glimmered with hunger and obsession. Elijah became more than a servant, he was their shared obsession, the vessel through which they enacted an impossible authority over life and sin. Guilt and power intermingled, producing psychological torment for both perpetrator and victim. He whispered to the walls, begging the God he had been taught to trust to witness his suffering. But the walls remained silent. The children born from this secret became symbols of the nuns' dominion, hidden away in rooms that smelled of dust, milk, and fear. Elijah's mind fractured, oscillating between compliance, self-loathing, and fleeting hope that someone, anyone, would intervene. Margaret, the youngest nun, was initially hesitant, trembling at the thought of sin. But with each ritual, her conscience was reshaped into devotion. Her pregnancy was a turning point, she began to rationalize every act as part of divine will. The convent's twisted doctrine consumed her, and she started to perceive Elijah less as a man and more as an instrument of sacred prophecy. Margaret's journal entries, later recovered, reveal a disturbing spiral: the Lord speaks through him. My hands tremble with his purpose. I am both sinner and vessel. Her handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, reflecting the strain of sustaining a moral lie while committing acts that violated every tenet of her faith. Beneath the convent, a hidden chamber held the evidence of years of abuse: drawings, journals, small garments, and objects imbued with ritual significance. Candles melted into grotesque shapes, and the air was heavy with a cloying scent of incense, blood, and mildew. Here, the nuns orchestrated births, concealments, and ceremonies. Visitors would never find it, the staircase was hidden behind a false wall, known only to those complicit in the ritual. It became a liminal space where morality, faith, and horror collided, a secret universe in which Elijah existed as property, the nuns as priestesses of a forbidden covenant, and children as living symbols of transgression. By the 5th year, 6 children had been born. Each one was hidden meticulously, some sent to orphanages with falsified records, others confined within the convent. They were neither acknowledged nor christened publicly, their existence a testament to control and secrecy. These children absorbed the tension of the convent, learning fear as early as their first breath. Some developed symptoms of trauma, withdrawn behavior, self-harm, and whispered mutterings that hinted at knowledge too profound for their age. The convent became a living organism of horror, where silence was the language that preserved power. The nuns practiced more than physical control, they practiced psychological domination. Elijah was gaslit, told that his suffering was divine testing. Children were trained in obedience and secrecy. Any attempt at dissent was met with punishment disguised as instruction, prayer, or reflection. This systematic conditioning ensured that the horrors remained invisible to the outside world. Even priests who visited were subtly manipulated, their confessions intercepted or twisted, their reports sanitized. Fear was codified as faith, and faith became a mechanism of oppression. A few residents noticed inconsistencies: the absence of certain children, the faint cries at night, and occasional flickers of candlelight in forbidden rooms. Some spoke out and were swiftly discredited, labeled overly imaginative, hysterical, or possessed by sin. Whispers persisted, but institutional power silenced them. The nuns leveraged their societal position to shield the convent from scrutiny. Willowbrook became a town where appearances mattered more than reality, where morality was performative, and horror was hidden behind sacred hymns and veiled piety. By 1888, Elijah was exhausted, mentally fractured, and increasingly desperate. The cycle of abuse had persisted for 5 years, each act reinforcing the nun's sense of entitlement and divine purpose. His will had been stripped, replaced with a muted, haunted endurance. Margaret, who had once hesitated, now orchestrated rituals with cold precision. Her journal entries reflect her transformation from innocent novice to a figure complicit in systemic horror. The convent, once a haven, had become a prison of power, ritual, and obsession. In 1923, decades later, a letter was discovered in a forgotten diocesan archive. It described the events at St. Agnes in cryptic, fragmented language, references to 12 vessels, 1 servant, and unholy births. The Vatican reportedly attempted to confiscate the letter, fearing scandal and disruption of faith. This correspondence confirmed what the townspeople had long suspected but dared not name: a ritualized exploitation of the most fundamental human bonds, cloaked in sanctity and preserved by silence. Evidence suggests the church hierarchy knew more than it admitted. Confessional records, correspondence, and hidden archives hint at tacit approval or willful blindness. The nuns' ability to continue their acts over years relied on a system designed to protect appearances over truth, doctrine over morality. The scandal, once unearthed, revealed a haunting pattern. Institutions often prioritize self-preservation over justice, enabling trauma to fester for generations. The children who survived carried lifelong trauma. Elijah vanished from records, presumed dead or disappeared. The nuns aged, leaving behind manuscripts, journals, and artifacts that scholars now describe as visions of institutionalized horror. Descendants of the town report unexplained behavior in their ancestors, mental illness, paranoia, unshakable fear, which some researchers link to the lingering imprint of St. Agnes' atrocities. By 1888, Elijah was exhausted, mentally fractured, and increasingly desperate. The cycle of abuse had persisted for 5 years, each act reinforcing the nun's sense of entitlement and divine purpose. His will had been stripped, replaced with a muted, haunted endurance. Margaret, who had once hesitated, now orchestrated rituals with cold precision. Her journal entries reflect her transformation from innocent novice to a figure complicit in systemic horror. The convent, once a haven, had become a prison of power, ritual, and obsession. In 1923, decades later, a letter was discovered in a forgotten diocesan archive. It described the events at St. Agnes in cryptic, fragmented language, references to 12 vessels, 1 servant, and unholy births. The Vatican reportedly attempted to confiscate the letter, fearing scandal and disruption of faith. This correspondence confirmed what the townspeople had long suspected but dared not name: a ritualized exploitation of the most fundamental human bonds, cloaked in sanctity and preserved by silence. Evidence suggests the church hierarchy knew more than it admitted. Confessional records, correspondence, and hidden archives hint at tacit approval or willful blindness. The nuns' ability to continue their acts over years relied on a system designed to protect appearances over truth, doctrine over morality. The scandal, once unearthed, revealed a haunting pattern. Institutions often prioritize self-preservation over justice, enabling trauma to fester for generations. The children who survived carried lifelong trauma. Elijah vanished from records, presumed dead or disappeared. The nuns aged, leaving behind manuscripts, journals, and artifacts that scholars now describe as visions of institutionalized horror. Descendants of the town report unexplained behavior in their ancestors, mental illness, paranoia, unshakable fear, which some researchers link to the lingering imprint of St. Agnes' atrocities. In the 1970s, a historian stumbled upon the convent's ruins. Burnt pages, half-erased journals, and the remnants of the hidden chamber told stories of coercion, abuse, and ritualized control. The historian's writing suggests the events were both horrific and meticulously concealed, leaving few traces but profound emotional residue. Upon discovery of documentation, the Vatican initiated quiet investigations, suppressing public disclosure. Reports indicate an intent to erase names, destroy records, and prevent scandal from reaching parishioners. The secrecy underscores the tension between faith and institutional reputation, between morality and power. The psychological and emotional fallout continues to resonate. Townsfolk recount eerie coincidences, sudden illnesses, and whispers of children appearing in dreams. Historians argue that trauma, especially ritualized trauma, leaves a generational imprint, and St. Agnes events were no exception. The horror of the past infiltrates the present. The convent stands in ruin, yet the memory persists, a cautionary tale of power, secrecy, and corrupted devotion. St. Agnes, home for the forsaken, remains a monument to concealed horror. 12 nuns, one enslaved man, and generations of hidden children embody a forgotten history of cruelty and complicity. The story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths: institutions can shelter evil, faith can be weaponized, and silence can perpetuate trauma for decades. As the camera pans over the crumbling spires at sunset, the wind carries whispers that hint at the past, the prayers, the screams, the unrecorded births. It's a story of human darkness masquerading as holiness, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest horrors are hidden in plain sight.